Carl and Gwyn stepped off the sliding walkway that led into the Galactic Assemblies hall, doing his best to keep his posture unassuming. The hall itself was a marvel of interstellar architecture, 10 stories high, shaped in a spiral that could accommodate over 400 species, each with unique gravitational needs, atmospheric requirements, and physical proportions. Overhead, strips of luminescent filaments shone in pale gold, providing a diffuse light that helped everyone see without straining the eyes or other visual organs of any particular species. Carl didn't bring much with him, given the scrutiny that always befell Earth delegations. He had surrendered his bag at the perimeter checkpoint, and the inspectors, 2 insectoid praxians and 1 small, levitating orb from the planet Alara, had carefully combed through the contents: a pen, a travel mug, a digital notepad, even a packet of breath mints. Every single item had to be documented, labeled, and either confiscated or placed in a shielded container. The rules were, as always, strict. No human was permitted to carry objects inside the hall, not even something as innocuous as a piece of chewing gum. Carl let out a measured breath, quietly surveying the swirl of activity around him. Representatives from every corner of the galaxy milled about in the wide, circular lobby. His gaze followed a delegation of Makari, tall, crystalline beings whose sharp edges refracted the golden light in dazzling patterns. Just a few meters beyond them, a cluster of Xerion used their sinuous, translucent tentacles to communicate via subtle pulses of electric current, making the air crackle with faint static. Everywhere he looked, there were species whose bodies seemed naturally equipped with specialized defenses or unique adaptations. Yet, ironically, it was humans who were singled out by that one specific regulation, Regulation 426, that forbade them from bringing so much as a fountain pen into these diplomatic chambers. Beside Carl walked Alyssa Dorwell, an Earth security liaison who looked more exasperated than usual. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and she wore a formal black uniform emblazoned with the Earth emblem, a stylized globe with orbit rings. She had just finished handing over her entire set of personal items at the checkpoint: a short flashlight, a small tool that was a cross between a multi-purpose pocket knife and a set of tweezers, and even a miniature first aid kit. The check-in clerks had insisted each piece be tested for weaponizable potential. "I swear," Alyssa muttered under her breath, "if we showed up in swimsuits, they'd probably claim we could strangle someone with the straps." Carl suppressed a smile. "We'd best not give them ideas. Admiral Virak might propose that humans be forced to come naked." At the mention of Admiral Virak, Alyssa's jaw tightened. The Svaronian admiral had been the most vocal proponent of strengthening the ban against humans. Svaronians were large, heavily armored humanoids, known for their organic exoskeleton that could deflect small-caliber projectiles. Virak's personal stance was that the creative ingenuity of the human mind was as lethal as, if not more so, than any advanced weapon system. According to rumor, he was lobbying to ensure that humans faced even stricter measures, including more thorough body scans and perhaps even restrictions on their presence within certain high-security zones of the hall. Ahead of them, a gentle hum of conversation rose and fell as delegates found their respective stations. The hall's main chamber, a colossal amphitheater with tiered seating, would be sealed off for official sessions. For now, representatives mingled in the open lobby space where luminous signage indicated everything from atmospheric microzone areas to trans-species dining halls. Carl could see various species grouping off, discussing trade deals, border disputes, or new technological exchanges. This was how the grand business of the galaxy was conducted, quietly, politely, with undertones of tension always present just beneath the surface. Alyssa motioned for Carl to follow her toward one of the side corridors, where the Earth delegation's designated waiting area had been set up. A large sign reading, "Human Delegation, please comply with Regulation 426, glowed in multiple languages, including standard Galactic Basic and Aladdin script used on Earth. The corridor was lined with pale metallic panels that reflected the occasional glint from passing delegates. Carl noticed a few curious stares, as if onlookers wondered if the humans might spontaneously assemble a weapon out of thin air. Alyssa keyed opened the door to a waiting lounge. Immediately inside stood an automated refreshments dispenser, though it was cordoned off by a barrier labeled "Human Access Restricted Without Clearance." The irony wasn't lost on Carl. Something as benign as a beverage machine was apparently viewed as a potential hazard in human hands. Sighing, he crossed to the lounge's central table and sat down, leaning his elbows on his knees. "You know," he remarked to Alyssa, "I understand the underlying logic. We humans are resourceful, but the rest of these delegates have built-in lethal edges, stingers, psychic powers, or whatever else. How is that not a bigger problem?" Alyssa rubbed her temple. "It's not about raw power. It's about unpredictability. That's the official line, anyway. The Assembly doesn't trust how quickly we adapt objects for, well, any purpose we can imagine." Carl thought back to the time a friend of his had used a toothpick, a rubber band, and a chunk of plastic to launch a makeshift projectile across a dorm room. "We do have a bit of a track record," he admitted wryly. "But is that reason enough to bar us from carrying stuff like pens or scanners?" Before she could respond, the lounge door slid open. In walked two staffers from the joint security team. One was a bipedal insectoid with glittering compound eyes, while the other was a floating orb with spindly appendages. They approached with a sort of practiced caution, as though worried that Carl and Alyssa might brandish a table lamp or a coffee cup. The insectoid staffer clicked its mandibles softly, translating through a small device pinned to its thorax. "Esteemed representatives of Earth, you are requested to enter the preliminary discussion area. High Arbiter Rax 14 has requested your presence, along with others, to address certain concerns regarding Regulation 426. Please follow us." Carl gave a polite nod. "Lead the way." He and Alyssa stood, trailing behind a duo. Their footsteps made a soft echo against the corridor's polished floor. Carl's heartbeat quickened, even though outwardly he maintained a calm facade. For years, the Earth delegation had pushed for the repeal, or at least the revision, of this singular regulation that singled out humanity. Finally, it seemed there was a chance to make some headway. They arrived at a smaller conference room, shaped like an elongated oval, with rows of seats arranged around a raised podium. Already present were a handful of other delegations. Carl recognized the tall, angular forms of two Makari envoys, whose crystalline limbs sparkled under the overhead lights. Nearby, the Mechanoid Collective's representative hovered in a metal exoframe, a living AI intelligence that thrummed with power. In front, clad in the dark blue uniform of the Svaronian Defense Fleet, stood Admiral Virak. He turned slightly as the humans entered, his eyes flicking with a cold, assessing stare. High Arbiter Rax 14 floated above a central dais, their body composed of a swirling mass of opalescent energy contained within a translucent shell. They spoke without moving any mouth or visible organ, their voice emanating from an embedded translator. "Delegates of Earth," Rax 14 intoned, "we gather here for a preliminary discussion regarding the necessity and scope of Regulation 426. Please be seated." Carl and Alyssa exchanged a quick glance, then found places in the second row. The interior temperature felt a touch too cool for typical human comfort, but it was better than many other environments they'd endured. On Earth, they'd grown used to moderate climates, though not to the extremes that some world displayed. Rax 14 continued, "We have convened this meeting in anticipation of next week's official Assembly session, wherein the question of revising or abolishing Regulation 426 will be voted upon. Admiral Virak will present his position for strengthening the regulation. The human delegation will be permitted a response. Other delegates, of course, may contribute relevant points. Let us begin." Virak stepped forward, his exoskeletal plating glinting with an oily sheen under the lights. He drew himself up to his full height, towering over the dais, and addressed the room in a firm, resonant voice. "Esteemed Arbiter, esteemed delegates, as you know, Our galaxy thrives on harmony and the mutual respect of each species' unique capabilities. Yet humans, alone among us, have shown an alarming capacity to repurpose any object into a lethal device. While many species possess natural defenses, like the Macari's crystalline edges or the Xerian's electricity fields, humans stand apart because of their persistent, almost pathological drive to re-engineer their surroundings. Several heads in the room nodded in subdued agreement. Carl felt Alyssa stiffen next to him. He tried to remain composed. The Admiral pressed on. We have recorded incidents spanning decades. The fiasco on Gaian 3, in which a trio of Earth settlers dismantled automated security drones using improvised contraptions made from scrap metal and cleaning chemicals. The unfortunate meltdown on Station Adora, triggered by a human visitor who attempted to modify a simple beverage dispenser, leading to catastrophic system overload. The examples are plentiful, each one highlighting that humans pose a greater risk when unarmed than most species do with advanced weaponry. Virak shifted his stance, folding his armored arms across his chest. My proposal is straightforward. Regulation 426 remains insufficient. Not only should humans be barred from carrying objects of any kind, but we should also restrict them from interacting with certain critical technologies. If humans were forced to relinquish all personal possessions, including clothing with mechanical fasteners, footwear that could be disassembled, or devices like datapads, we would significantly reduce the probability of catastrophic repurposing. A hush settled over the chamber. Carl could sense the weight of these words. Virak's argument boiled down to doubling, or tripling, down on the existing restrictions, effectively treating humans as a permanent security hazard. Finally, High Arbiter Rack's 14th's ethereal voice broke the silence. Thank you, Admiral. Now, we invite a counterstatement from the Earth delegation. Carl stood, conscious of every eye and photoreceptor and scanning device locked upon him. High Arbiter, distinguished delegates. I am Carlisle Nguyen, representing Earth alongside my colleague, Alyssa Dorwell. Allow me to clarify something from the outset. Yes, humans are inventive. Yes, we have historically demonstrated an uncanny knack for repurposing objects. But that stems from our evolutionary history. We lacked natural armor or powerful defenses, so we survived by adapting every resource we could find. He paused, letting his words sink in. We do not deny the incidents listed by Admiral Virak, but consider the Macari. Their limbs can slice through hull plating as easily as a sharpened blade. The Xerian can incapacitate an opponent with a well-timed electric discharge. Mechanoid AI can override many forms of computer security. Meanwhile, humans who, ironically, are physically weaker than many species, are singled out under Regulation 426. We ask, is that truly just? And does it even provide the security everyone assumes? A murmur rippled through the spectators. Carl pressed on, voice steady. If you examine the data carefully, you'll see that in nearly 2 decades of enforcing Regulation 426, not a single Earth delegation has caused a major security breach. Any damage or meltdown typically occurred outside official assembly sessions. Meanwhile, the ongoing restriction burdens both Earth representatives and the assembly staff, who must spend time and resources conducting thorough searches of items as simple as a ballpoint pen. Admiral Virak's mandibles clicked, and he interjected, if humans are as harmless as you claim, how do you explain the meltdown on Station Adora? Carl inclined his head, unperturbed. Our analysis of that event indicates the meltdown was primarily due to faulty engineering in the beverage dispenser's interface. The human visitor tried to fix a jam valve, using what they believed was a standard approach. The system malfunctioned, leading to a power surge. Was it an error in judgment? Absolutely. But it was not a malicious act. Nor was it the unstoppable weapons-grade improvisation you portray it to be. He swept his gaze across the room, noticing how the mechanoid collective representative seemed to shift, as though analyzing the conversation's logic. My point is, we are labeled uniquely dangerous because of how we use our minds, because we can adapt. But that adaptation also makes us exceptional partners in crisis resolution. We can solve problems quickly. We can step into unfamiliar circumstances and re-engineer a solution. That is precisely the other side of the coin. Alyssa sat quietly, watching how delegates whispered to one another, some clearly intrigued by Carl's remarks. Virak let out a low hiss. Yes, that's exactly the worry. If humans can re-engineer your environment so easily, how can we be sure you will not do so deliberately for violence or sabotage? Carl sighed. Because we choose not to. Listen, we're well aware that if we wanted to, we could cause chaos, but that's true for almost any species in this chamber. The difference is that humans are barred from carrying objects, while others are allowed to keep natural abilities or tools. I might also add that a ban on objects doesn't address the real concern. If we wanted to sabotage something, we could do so with the environment's existing infrastructure. The measure does not truly keep anyone safe. It merely creates the illusion of safety. Before Virak could retort, High Arbiter Rak's 14th's swirling body glowed softly, signaling an end to the direct exchange. We will have ample time for further discussion at the official session. For now, thank you both for your remarks. We will adjourn and reconvene next week to address the comprehensive debate on Regulation 426. Until then, the regulation remains in effect. Carl gave a polite nod. He cast a sideways glance at Virak, who stared back with a stern, unreadable expression. A moment later, the Admiral pivoted sharply and strode off, exoskeleton shimmering in the overhead lights. The other delegates began to disperse, and the tension in the air lingered like residual static. Alyssa touched Carl's arm. "Well done, or at least well begun," she murmured. "Still, Admiral Virak is going to do everything in his power to push for stricter rules." Carl lowered his voice as they walked. "We can't let that happen. The best approach might be to highlight how pointless it is to single out humans when so many species have built-in lethal capacities. If the Assembly truly wants to be fair, they'd have to ban half the delegates from walking around with their natural abilities." Alyssa nodded. "We have less than a week until the vote. In the meantime, I suggest we gather more allies, people and species who are neutral or open-minded about us. If we convince enough delegates to see the flaws in 426, we might overturn it." As they exited the conference room, they found themselves in the corridor once more amid a milling group of delegates. A towering Makari with elongated crystal limbs approached them hesitantly. Through the Makari's translator, a quiet, melodic voice emerged. "Karlong Win, Alyssa Dorwell, I am Envoy Siloni of the Makari. Your arguments carry some merit. I was curious, however, about the rumor that humans once used chewing gum to seal an atmospheric leak in a space station. This rumor has circulated widely as an example of your unpredictable ingenuity." Carl half smiled. "Yes, that's actually true. A low-pressure leak in a hull breach was temporarily sealed by chewing gum and duct tape until a more permanent fix could be made. Humans are known to try everything when the chips are down." Envoy Siloni's crystalline surfaces rippled with something akin to interest. "Fascinating, and that is precisely why some fear you. Yet I find it admirable." Carl decided that building rapport was crucial. He explained how such creativity was not inherently dangerous, how it could save lives. Siloni listened intently, and Alyssa could see the envoy was torn between fascination and caution, a conflict that was probably echoed in many delegates' minds. Over the next few days, Carl and Alyssa worked tirelessly behind the scenes, meeting with representatives from species that had less rigid stances on Regulation 426. Some were curious about the actual data, some were swayed by the arguments of fairness and consistency, and still others had commercial reasons. Certain companies that wanted to sell product to humans without the constant threat of confiscation. However, they also discovered troubling signs of an entrenched economic interest in preserving the regulation. On the second day, Alyssa gathered intelligence from an offhand remark made by a technical consultant for the Mechanoid Collective. Entire industries had sprung up to produce human-proof technology, devices, rooms, locks, and scanners specifically designed to withstand or neutralize improvisational tampering. These garnered premium prices. By upholding Regulation 426 and the official fear surrounding humans, these industries thrived. Removing the regulation could disrupt a market worth billions of credits. Alyssa relayed this to Carl one evening in the Earth delegation's small suite in the orbiting habitat ring, her face tense. "You see the problem," she said. "Economic incentives. They profit off the narrative that humans are so cunning and dangerous that everything must be reinforced. That's going to be hard to overturn." Carl exhaled, pressing his palms against the edge of a glass table. "It won't be enough for us to just say, hey, we're not that dangerous. We have to prove to them that 426 doesn't offer the security they think it does. Maybe we can also show them that mutual cooperation with humans yields bigger benefits than this arms race of human-proofing technology." Alyssa nodded. "We have less than 5 days until the official session. Let's gather stats, testimonies from species that have worked positively with humans. If we can demonstrate that the real hazard is universal, everyone can be dangerous if they choose to be, maybe we'll shift the conversation." Time seemed to accelerate as the official session neared. Carl and Alyssa hardly slept. They compiled examples where humans and other species collaborated to solve crises. A human pilot assisting in an asteroid deflection, a human medical team improvising care with limited resources, humans designing specialized suits for aquatic species to help them operate in air-based environments. Each example testified to the constructive side of that same resourceful spirit so many found alarming. At last, the day of reckoning arrived. Delegates flowed into the main hall, an enormous amphitheater with layered seating arranged in concentric arcs around a central platform. Carl and Alyssa, wearing simple but elegant formal attire that had no metallic fasteners or extraneous pockets, joined the Earth delegation in Section 49 in the midst of nearly 400 distinct enclaves. Above, high arbiter racks, 14 hovered in the apex of the hall, their opalescent energies shifting in luminous waves. A hush fell as Rack's 14th's resonant voice echoed across the amphitheater, greeting everyone. The day's agenda materialized on thousands of floating holo displays in different languages. Near the top of the list was Petition to Reconsider Regulation 426. Anticipation hung thick in the air. Rack's 14 began the proceedings, briefly summarizing the historical background of 426, referencing major incidents like the meltdown on Station Adora and the fiasco on Gaian 3. Then, they invited Admiral Virak to present the case for maintaining or strengthening the regulation. The Admiral stepped onto the central platform, tall and imposing. "Fellow delegates," he rumbled, "we gather here today to decide whether humankind should continue to be restricted from carrying any object within these chambers. For centuries, we have accepted that humans, while physically weaker than many of us, are disproportionately skilled at converting common items into dangerous tools. We have not done this out of malice. We have done it out of caution, to protect ourselves and maintain the delicate balance of trust in this assembly. In the past months, I have reviewed records of unauthorized modifications, sabotage, and near-sabotage attempts involving humans. Indeed, 426 has not prevented every incident outside these walls, but it has prevented many from occurring here. I propose not only keeping 426, but extending it. Humans should face systematic limitations on their movement in high-security areas. Such steps are necessary if we value the safety and stability of this institution." The hush that followed was palpable. Carl braced himself. This was even more extreme than Virak's earlier statements. It suggested Earth delegates might be relegated to only specific areas, effectively quarantined. Several species turned their gazes to the Earth section, and Carl felt the weight of those stares. Then Rax 14's voice cut through the silence. "Human delegation, you have the floor." Carl rose, making his way to the central platform. He stood under the spotlight's glow, aware of how small he might seem to these towering alien forms. But his voice was clear as he began. Esteemed delegates, my name is Carlisle Nguyen. I speak on behalf of Earth. Let me say from the start that I understand your concerns. Humans do adapt things quickly. We can turn mundane objects into problem-solving tools. Sometimes that includes weaponry. But you must ask yourselves, does a ban on objects address the core concern, or does it simply mask it? An unarmed human can still use the environment, lights, fixtures, data terminals, or even bits of trash, to fashion something harmful if that was our goal. Regulation 426 provides a false sense of security. It inconveniences everyone, fosters mistrust, and ultimately fails to prevent the scenario it was designed to avoid. He paused, letting the words resonate, then continued. Our historians remind us that many species here have innate, built-in advantages. Mikari can carve through metal, Xerion can disable electronics, and the Svaronian exoskeleton is nearly impervious to small arms fire. If the premise is that anyone capable of harming others must be forcibly disarmed, then shouldn't we also muzzle or inhibit these natural traits? Surely the Assembly wouldn't consider that. It would be unthinkable. Yet humans, who must rely on crafted tools rather than inherent biology, are singled out for restrictions. Is that fair? More importantly, is that effective? A stir of conversation rippled through the crowd. Some delegates leaned forward, seemingly intrigued. Admiral Virak interjected from his seat, voice amplified by a personal microphone. You skirt the main issue, Mr. Nguyen. We are not punishing humans for having the capacity to harm. We're simply removing the means by which you might do so. You said it yourself. If you wanted to cause trouble, you'd use the environment. Then shall we give you even more resources? That logic seems flawed. Carl recognized the trap in Virak's words, but he pressed on. We do not deny that some humans could misuse those resources. My argument is that the threat does not originate from an external object. It originates from the creative mind, which can repurpose anything, including its own environment. By focusing on these confiscations, we ignore the real factor, intent. It is that which we should monitor, not a pen or a multi-tool. He drew a steadying breath. Furthermore, if we examine the last 17 years of official assembly sessions, we see no proven case of human sabotage that was prevented by 426. Not once did security discover a hidden weapon that a human was about to deploy in the chambers. Meanwhile, the regulation has placed enormous strain on interspecies relations, fueling the notion that humans are pariahs, that we cannot be trusted at a fundamental level. This dynamic undermines mutual respect, the very foundation of the Assembly. If you truly wish to guard against sabotage, then invest in robust security protocols that apply equally to everyone, or create environment-based safety measures. Don't single out one species with a rule that accomplishes little except stigmatizing them. Carl nodded to Alyssa, who was seated with a collection of data slides. The large displays around the chamber came to life with references to real partnerships. Earth medics collaborating with a Xerion rescue unit, Earth engineers working side by side with Mikari architects to fortify starship hull designs. Scenes of trust and cooperation filled the screens, culminating in facts and figures that highlighted the advantage of harnessing human ingenuity rather than fearing it. Look at these examples, Carl continued. Every time we introduced humans to a challenging environment, we not only adapted, we found ways to improve the circumstances for all parties involved. And that is the heart of the matter. Our resourcefulness can be a boon or a curse, but so can the capabilities of every species. The hush that followed was profound. Even Virak seemed to weigh these words. After a moment, Rax, 14, intervened, swirling with gentle pulses of light. We will open the floor to commentary from other delegates. Please be concise, as many wish to speak. First to rise was Envoy Siloni of the Mikari. Their crystalline surfaces caught and refracted the overhead lights in prismatic bursts. I have listened carefully. We, the Mikari, have historically been cautious around humans, but also intrigued. We recognize how swiftly they can adapt technology. We do not endorse banning them from carrying objects, for as Mr. Gwen has said, it does not truly mitigate risk if the real threat is creativity itself. We are open to reconsideration of 426. A wave of murmurs swept through the hall. Next, a spherical robot body advanced slightly. The Mechanoid Collective representative. We have run predictive models analyzing the security benefits of 426. Our computations show that removing 426 raises unpredictability by 4% in controlled scenarios. However, if the fundamental impetus is sabotage, that sabotage might be orchestrated with or without external objects. Our model, thus, concludes that 426 does not significantly alter the risk factor, only the method. We prefer advanced scanning and real-time threat detection applied to all delegates, not only humans. Carl closed his eyes for a moment, relief washing through him. The conversation was turning, but it wasn't over yet. Admiral Virak stood once more, ignoring the typical courtesy of allowing other delegates to speak in sequence. His deep voice reverberated through the hall. Let me remind this assembly of the meltdown on Station Adora. Let me remind you of the fiasco on Gaian 3. Perhaps these were not malicious, but the end result was catastrophic nonetheless. Humans meddled with equipment, improvised solutions, and caused widespread damage. Now imagine if such meddling took place in this hall, or during a critical vote, or near life support systems. A single slip of a wire, an overloaded circuit, a forced reaction of chemical substances, these can cause irreparable harm. That is why 426 was enacted. I ask that we do not forget. A hush fell again. Then Alyssa Dorwell rose. She had asked permission beforehand to make an additional statement, and Rax, 14, granted it with a gentle nod. Stepping onto the platform beside Carl, she addressed the Admiral directly. Admiral Virak, she said, voice measured yet forceful. I was part of the security detail that studied the meltdown on Station Adora. The fault lay in a manufacturing defect in the dispenser's interface that the manufacturer had not disclosed to the station staff. The meltdown was triggered by a design flaw in the coolant distribution, which the human visitor accidentally exposed while attempting to clear a blockage. I don't deny that humans can be impulsive or creative to a fault, but that incident is often cited out of context to demonize us. Gaian 3? Yes. Humans turn scraps into tools to defend themselves against malfunctioning security drones. But it was the drone's malfunction that started the chain reaction. More importantly, none of these events would have been prevented by forbidding them from having personal items. They used station resources, the environment itself. This is why we argue that 426 does not truly address the root cause. Her words hung in the air. Many in the room seemed conflicted, especially those who had clung to the official stories of those incidents without delving deeper. Rax, 14, gestured, or rather, pulsed with light to indicate that further debate would follow, but that the time had come to move to the Assembly's primary discussion and eventual vote. The tension was tangible as the official portion of the session concluded and delegates broke into smaller gatherings to negotiate their stances. What followed was a swirl of behind-the-scenes diplomacy. Carl and Alyssa repeated the same points in private side chats, while Admiral Virak lobbied for stricter enforcement. The sense of uncertainty was everywhere, representatives whispering in corners, scanning data on their wrist holograms, exchanging quiet remarks. But Carl noticed, with cautious optimism, that the tide seemed to be shifting in Earth's favor. Many species had grown weary of the special ban on humans, especially those who saw humans as beneficial trade partners, creative innovators, or simply potential allies. Still, the existing fear was not easy to dispel. Horror stories of misguided or accidental weaponization circulated widely. Finally, on the third day of official debate, Rax, 14, reconvened the Assembly to announce that a vote on Regulation 426 would be taken. A hush enveloped the amphitheater as each delegation's seat lit up with color-coded panels, enabling them to choose: maintain 426, strengthen it, or revoke it. The results would appear in real time on the overhead displays. Carl's pulse thundered in his ears. Alyssa stood by his side, looking outwardly poised, though he could feel her tension. Admiral Virak observed from across the amphitheater, expression unreadable. Envoys from hundreds of worlds prepared to register their positions. One by one, the lights flashed. Carl couldn't help but watch the tall display at the center of the hall. It showed 3 columns: retain 426, strengthen 426, revoke 426. His heart lurched as the early results favored retention or strengthening. But then, steadily, revoke votes began climbing. Delegation after delegation weighed in. Finally, the tally froze with a muted chime, and Rack's 14's amplified voice carried the verdict. Delegates, the results are conclusive. 320 votes in favor of revoking 426. 75 votes for retaining it as is. 5 abstentions. 0 successful tallies for strengthening it, as that required a minimum threshold that was not met. By the authority vested in this assembly, Regulation 426 is hereby revoked, effective immediately. For a moment, silence reigned. Then a murmur rose, growing into a cacophony of chatter that swept the amphitheater. The Earth delegation began to exhale the collective breath they'd been holding. Carl closed his eyes, feeling an overwhelming mix of relief and triumph. Alyssa grabbed his arm in a small victory squeeze, her face blossoming into a rare smile. Admiral Virak stood rigid, his exoskeleton shimmering. He stared at the central display, then at Rax, 14, and then at Carl, a look of profound frustration crossing his features. Nevertheless, the law was the law. He dipped his head in a curt gesture, acknowledging the outcome, then strode from the chamber, his posture radiating displeasure. Rax 14's voice swept through the din. Delegates, may we have order, please? Though 426 is revoked, we recognize legitimate concerns remain. Therefore, we propose drafting a new security framework that emphasizes environment-based safeguards and universal scanning for all delegates who enter restricted areas, regardless of species. This will be a matter for subsequent sessions, but rest assured, the Assembly is committed to maintaining peace and fairness. Carl and Alyssa rose, making their way through the throng of delegates. More than a few approached them. Envoy Siloni offered a crystalline handshake of sorts, praising Carl's arguments. The mechanoid collective representative emitted a polite series of beeps signifying approval. Even a stoic draconian security chief briefly inclined his horned head in recognition, grudgingly admitting the logic behind the new arrangement. Alyssa couldn't help but laugh softly. I still can't believe it's gone. After so many years of that regulation. Carl nodded, scanning the faces around them. It's the right step, but we'll probably see new restrictions or guidelines introduced, ones that apply equally to everyone. It's not about letting humans do whatever they want. It's about fairness. At least we won't be singled out for carrying a pen. They stepped into the main corridor, which teemed with excitement and discussion. For the first time in years, there was no assigned guard waiting to confiscate or verify their personal items. A small cluster of reporters from various species approached, microphones and recorders at the ready. A Xerian journalist pulsed with arcs of pale blue electricity, speaking in a mechanical voice through its translator. Ambassador Nguyen, do you believe the galaxy is now safe from human improvisational sabotage? Carl met the question with a patient smile. I believe the galaxy was never in danger from the average human carrying an everyday object. The real question is whether we trust each other enough to let creativity be a shared asset rather than a liability. He turned away from the cameras, letting the swirl of the crowd envelop him and Alyssa. With the formal session ended, the new era for humans in the Galactic Assemblies was just beginning. There would be new security measures, new protocols to adapt to, and no shortage of caution from certain delegates. But at least now, there was a door open for Earth to participate as equals. That evening, in the Earth Delegation's lounge, previously off-limits to anything that resembled personal property, Carl and Alyssa sipped from actual cups of coffee they'd retrieved from a small dispenser they'd installed with the Assembly's permission. It was still a novelty to be able to have those items in the hall without layers of red tape. The taste of the coffee, warm and slightly bitter, felt like a tangible sign of change. "I guess we won," Alyssa said, setting her cup down. "Or at least we won this round." Carl ran a hand through his hair. "It's less a victory and more a reprieve from misguided policy. We'll still have to prove we can be trusted. But yes, it's a relief to be able to carry a normal set of items." He looked out a window at the swirling starscape beyond, ships coming and going from the station's docking arms. There was a sense of possibility in that view. Humans might be clever, cunning, or dangerously inventive to some, but they were also now recognized for the potential that had always been there, to collaborate, to innovate for good, and to exist on equal footing with the rest of the galaxy. A short while later, they left the lounge to walk the corridors of the newly minted, no longer human-restricted zones, reflecting on how swiftly the tide had turned after so many years. A group of Sphyronians passed by, and though they offered no warm greeting, neither did they glare with suspicion. Carl exchanged a polite nod, grateful for the shift in atmosphere. Stopping at a massive panoramic window overlooking the curved hull of the station, Alyssa took in the grandness of it all. "Do you ever think," she said quietly, "about how improbable it was that we even ended up part of this big interstellar club?" Carl glanced at her. "Every day. We're a bunch of hairless primates who managed to fling ourselves into FTL space. Now we're haggling with crystalline beings and telepathic cephalopods about whether we're too creative for our own good. It's surreal." She laughed, a warmth in her tone that matched the glimmer of the distant stars. "At least we're not singled out anymore. I can't wait to see how they react when we show them how some of our tech works, or what new solutions we come up with for shared problems. Maybe the next step is to invite them to Earth, so they can see we're not all about accidental chaos. Some of us are about deliberate chaos," Carl joked, but then shook his head. "But yes, it's time they visit Earth. See the billions of humans who get through their day just fine, using their environment creatively without turning it into bombs and traps." They paused, letting the hum of the station's systems fill the silence. For a moment, Carl considered the symbolic weight of everything that had transpired: the fear, the regulation, the debate, the revocation. In the end, it all pointed to a deeper truth, that no law, however well-intentioned, could eliminate risk born from the mind. Safety, in the cosmic sense, was always going to be a balance of trust, vigilance, and cooperation. Days passed, and formal ceremonies followed. High Arbiter Rax, 14, glowing with a vibrant opalescence, personally thanked the Earth delegation for their candor, while also reminding them that the period of reintegration would require mutual respect. Admiral Virak, for his part, remained stiff and formal, acknowledging the vote but cautioning that any catastrophic incident involving humans in the hall will reflect on all who supported revoking 426. Carl assured him that Earth took such responsibilities seriously, promising open lines of communication whenever potential safety issues arose. Behind the scenes, negotiations began to draft a new policy that set uniform scanning procedures for every delegate, key to detect abnormally high risk factors such as active sabotage attempts or dangerously altered device configurations. Carl found a certain poetic justice in the outcome. No longer would humans be singled out for carrying pins, but likewise, no delegate could now breeze through with hidden gadgets that might disrupt the proceedings. In a sense, fairness had ironically led to more robust overall security. Late one night, after the final session of the day, Carl wandered alone into one of the observation decks. The curved window spanned nearly the entire wall, revealing the swirling glow of a nearby star cluster. He recalled Earth's early days of space exploration, the rocket launches, the precarious steps on the moon, the eventual breakthroughs in faster-than-light travel. Humanity had come a long way from those times, and yet people were still people, governed by curiosity, imagination, and a certain penchant for forging new pathways. That same spirit that had once soared to the moon now frightened other species who had never witnessed such boundless creativity. And perhaps rightfully so, that creativity was a double-edged sword. He thought of the meltdown on Station Adora, that tragic series of mistakes that had fueled anti-human sentiment for decades. If only the station's systems had been better designed, if only the human technician had paused to consult the station staff. But dwelling on hypotheticals changed nothing. The meltdown had shaped history, crystallizing fear into Regulation 426. Now, at last, that chapter was closing, replaced by a new understanding that danger lay not in the object, but in the intent behind it. He closed his eyes, feeling the sense of relief that came with discarding the label of dangerous wildcard. Though Earth's delegates had endured years of mistrust, the path ahead looked brighter. Over the next days and weeks, he and Alyssa would work on forging alliances, exploring new joint ventures, and showing the galaxy that the same minds that could weaponize a plastic straw could also craft incredible advancements in healthcare, engineering, or exploration. When he returned to the Earth delegation's suite, he found Alyssa at the table, carefully examining a newly returned item from the confiscation storage, her multi-tool. She turned it over in her hands, a faint grin on her face. "Feels odd to have it back," she said, catching Carl's eye. "I never even realized how much this tool meant to me. I used it for everything from unscrewing panels to trimming loose threads. But to them, it was a ticking time bomb." Carl gently took the multi-tool from her, flipping open the small blade, then the screwdriver, then the tiny pliers. "I guess it was never about the tool itself, was it? Just how we might use it." She nodded thoughtfully. "We're all responsible for how we use our abilities, whatever they may be. Maybe that's the final lesson of this entire ordeal. We can't rely on external bans to keep us honest. We have to rely on mutual trust and accountability." They shared a moment of companionable silence, each thinking of what lay ahead. There would be challenges. Some species would always harbor doubts, ready to point a finger if a human malfunctioned a machine or improvised under stress. But step by step, Earth was earning its place as a fully recognized member of the galactic community, free from the shadow of that one law that singled them out. The next day, the official announcement of 420 SXS revocation was broadcast across the entire network of allied star systems. News anchors from dozens of worlds relayed the story, discussing the potential ramifications. Some predicted a new era of heightened vigilance, but also new collaborations. Earth stock in the interstellar markets even rose slightly, fueled by the promise of freer trade. There were humor pieces written about humans now being able to carry personal mugs and breath mints. Memes emerged on the subspace networks, showcasing comedic sketches of humans turning mundane items into improbable contraptions, which ironically helped defuse tension by leaning into the stereotype with good humor. Carl found himself interviewed for multiple outlets, each time reiterating the message that Earth never sought to be above the law, only to have laws applied fairly. Meanwhile, Admiral Virak was conspicuously quiet, offering only a single statement: "We will adapt as the Assembly decides. But we stand firm in our caution." Over time, some suspected that the Admiral and his allies would try to pass new regulations about requiring humans to wear biometric monitors or similar constraints. But the fervor was already fading. The rest of the galaxy seemed content to move on, adopting broader security measures that applied equally to everyone. On the final morning before Carl and Alyssa were scheduled to depart for a short return trip to Earth, they took a last stroll through the corridors of the hall. Passing a checkpoint that once bristled with sensors designed to detect forbidden human items, they saw it was now set to a universal scanning mode. An insectoid guard nodded politely as they walked by, not demanding that they empty their pockets. Alyssa absent-mindedly twirled her multi-tool in her hand, glancing with subdued amusement at how little fuss it caused now. They paused at the central rotunda, where a mosaic on the ceiling depicted the convergence of many species in the shape of a spiral galaxy. A plaque beneath it read, "United in diversity, bound by respect." Carl mused on how apt those words were. Respect had been lacking for a long time, replaced by paranoia. Yet, ironically, that paranoia had never eradicated the risk it aimed to stop. It had only delayed the real conversation. The conversation about trust, about the reality that every species brought potential danger and potential brilliance to the table. For a lingering moment, they stood there, letting the swirl of activity pass around them. Nearby, a trio of Makari talked animatedly with a Xerian envoy, discussing a project that involved using crystallized fiber optics to enhance telepathic signals. On the far side, the Mechanoid Collective hovered in deep conversation with a pair of Draconians about engineering solutions for a newly colonized planet. It struck Carl that none of these dialogues would be possible without the fundamental willingness of so many different life forms to coexist in this place, bridging differences and forging alliances. That was the true spirit of the Galactic Assemblies, overshadowed of late by fear-driven legislation like 426. Alyssa touched Carl's shoulder. "Ready to head to our ship?" He nodded. "I think so. Our flight window is in a few hours. And to be honest, I'm looking forward to being back on Earth for a bit." She grinned. "Sure you don't want to stay here forever, with unlimited coffee cups and potential arguments with Virak?" Carl laughed, shaking his head. "Not exactly, but it feels good to leave on a positive note. Maybe when we come back, the place will be even more open to what we can bring. Tools, technology, maybe some Earth music or art. Who knows?" They made their way down the corridor. At the docking bay, a large viewport overlooked the line of ships waiting to depart or arrive. The Earth vessel, the ECS Intrepid, gleamed under the station lights. As they approached the airlock, the persistent worry that someone would confiscate their items was gone. Security staff gave them a perfunctory scan, then waved them through. It was almost surreal. In the shuttle's airlock, Carl paused one final time to gaze back at the station. So many species, so many stories. And one abiding question that had loomed large for years. Why are humans the only species forbidden from carrying weapons in galactic assemblies? Now that question was no longer relevant. The official answer, finally, was they're not. He and Alyssa boarded the Intrepid. The airlock sealed, and the pressurized corridor led them deeper into the vessel. Techs bustled about, securing cargo and finalizing systems checks. They found their seats near the forward cabin, where they could watch the approach corridor on a monitor. In the seat next to them, a small potted plant, an earth fern, rested in a protective case. It was intended as a gift for the Xerian ambassador, a token of goodwill that, not so long ago, would have been thoroughly scanned and possibly confiscated. As the ship undocked, Carl felt a subtle shift in motion. The station receded from the forward camera's view, replaced by the starfield beyond. A sense of possibility expanded in his chest. There was a long road ahead for Earth's relationship with the rest of the galaxy. Fear and suspicion never vanished instantly, but at least they had removed a significant barrier. From now on, humans could walk among the other species with the same freedom to carry their personal effects, the same rights to demonstrate that their resourcefulness could be a boon, not merely a source of dread. Alyssa leaned back in her seat, exhaling a quiet sigh of relief. It almost feels anticlimactic after everything, but I'll take anticlimactic over perpetuating that old regulation. Carl smiled, letting the hush of the starship cabin settle over them. Maybe one day, they'll look back on 426 the way we look back on superstitions from Earth's past, just an artifact of fear that was eventually overcome by understanding. The ship's engines hummed as it oriented for the jump, the overhead lights dimming momentarily. In that peaceful lull, Carl allowed himself to envision the future. New alliances, co-engineering projects, maybe even Earth hosting a summit where the delegates from countless planets walked freely, carrying all manner of devices and personal items. No more singled-out lines for humans. No more suspicious glances at a harmless pen or multi-tool. Instead, a community genuinely united by the knowledge that the mind, not the object, determined risk. And with that knowledge came responsibility, one that humans would strive to uphold for the sake of their standing in the grand tapestry of the galaxy. He closed his eyes, and the ship surged forward, disappearing into faster-than-light space. The stars elongated into brilliant streaks, and the station vanished behind them in an instant. Their mission was complete for now. Humanity had earned a chance to prove itself under fairer rules. The question that had haunted them, why are humans the only species forbidden from carrying weapons in galactic assemblies, would slowly fade from memory. In its place would bloom a broader question, more hopeful and equally challenging. What wonders can we create together when we treat each other as equals?